of the companies, academics, began to find the content, really began to, investigative journalists would identify the name of a page, and then me and people like me would go and we would scour the internet looking for evidence of what was on that page. So I found a bunch of the stuff on Pinterest, for example, wrote about it. Guy by the name of Jonathan Albright found a CrowdTangle data cache, and with that we got the names of a bunch more pages, bunch more posts, and we had some really interesting stuff to work with. Originally, the platforms were very resistant to the idea that this had happened. And so as a result of that, they were there was the first thing that Zuck said in 2016 when, Trump gets elected, Twitter, it goes crazy that night with people who work at Twitter saying, oh my God, were we responsible for this, which is a very Silicon Valley thing to say. But what I think they meant by that was their platform had been implicated as hosting Russian bots and fake news and harassment mobs and a number of other things, and there was always the sense that it didn't have an impact and it didn't matter. And so this was the first time that they started to ask the question, did it matter? And then Zuck made that statement. Fake news is a very small percentage of, whatever on Facebook, the amount of information on Facebook, and the idea that it could have swung an election was ludicrous. So you have the platforms, kind of the leaders at the platforms digging in and saying it's inconceivable that this, could have happened. And as the research and the discovery begins to take place over the next 9 months or so, you get to when the tech hearings happen. So I worked with a guy by the name of Tristan Harris. He's the one who introduced me to Sam. And he and I started going to DC with third fellow Roger McNamee and saying, hey, there's this body of evidence that's coming out here, and we need to have a hearing. We need to have Congress ask the tech companies to account for what happened, to tell the American people what happened. Because what we're seeing here as outside researchers, what investigative journalists are writing, the things that we're finding just don't line up with the statements that nothing happened and this was all no big deal. And so we start asking for these hearings. And actually, myself and a couple of others then begin asking them in the course of these hearings, can you get them to give you the data? Because the platforms hadn't given the data. So it was that lobbying by concerned citizens and journalists and researchers saying, we have to have some accountability here. We have to have the platforms account for what happened. They have to tell people, because this had become such a politically divisive issue. Did it even happen? And we felt like having them actually sit there in front of Congress and account for it would be the first step towards moving forward in a way, but also towards changing the minds of the public and making them realize that what happened on social platforms matters. And it was really interesting to be part of that as it played out, because one of the things that Senator Blumenthal, one of the senators, did was actually said Facebook and Twitter have to notify people who engage with this content. And so there was this idea that if you are engaging with propagandist content, you should have the right to know. And so they started to push messages. Twitter sent out these emails to all these people saying you engaged with this Russian troll. And Facebook created a little field, a little page that told people if they had liked or followed a troll page. So it was really trying to get at making the platforms accountable.
But they did it outside the platform, through email, huh? Which is interesting because I would never read an email that Twitter sends me. Right? You're like, this has just got to be nonsense.
I didn't get one, so I guess I just got lucky. But
I might have had a multiple day back and forth with some Russian troll.
But that was, I think, one of the first steps towards saying, like, how do we make the platforms accountable? Because the idea that platforms should be accountable was not a thing that everybody agreed on in 2015 when we were having this conversation about ISIS. And that's where there's the through line here, which is, and it does connect into some of the speech issues too, which is, what kind of monitoring and moderation do you want the platforms to do? And when we were having this conversation about ISIS, there was not insignificant collection of voices that were really concerned that if we moderated ISIS trolls on Twitter, now not the beheading videos, there was sort of universal agreement that the beheading videos should come down. But if we took out what were called the ISIS fanboys, which were like 30, 40,000 accounts at their peak, that we would, there's a document called the ISIS Twitter Census for anyone who wants to actually see the research done on understanding the Twitter network in 2015. There was a sense that like one man's terrorist was another man's freedom fighter. And if we took down ISIS fanboys, were we stifling their freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and like, goodness, what would come next? And that, when you look at that, that fundamental swing that has happened now in 2018, 2019, where there's that same narrative, because originally no moderation was taking place, and then now there's a feeling that it's kind of swung too far in the other direction. But the original conversations were really, how do we make Twitter take responsibility for this? And legally, they aren't responsible for it, right? They are legally indemnified against they're not responsible for any of the content on their platforms. None of the platforms are. There's a law called Communications Decency Act, Section 230, and that says that they're not responsible. They have the right to moderate, but not the obligation to moderate, because they are indemnified from responsibility. So the question becomes, now that we know that these platforms are used for these kinds of harms and they are used for this kind of interference, where is that balance? What do we want them responsible for monitoring and moderating? And how do we recognize that that is occasionally going to lead to incorrect attributions, people losing accounts and things like that? So.
Yeah, they're in a weird conundrum right now where they're trying to keep everything safe, and they want to encourage people to communicate on the platform, so they want to keep people from harassing folks. But because of that, they've got these algorithms, and they tend to miss very often, like this whole learn to code fiasco, where people are getting banned for life for saying learn to code, which is about as preposterous as it gets. I think the learn to code fiasco is going to be the tipping point where a lot of people in the future, when they look back on when did the heavy-handedness become overreach, learn to code. Because, I mean, Jesus Christ, I mean, that if you can't say learn to code, I mean, I look at my mentions, I mean, on any given day, especially like yesterday, I had a vaccine proponent.
Yeah, I watched it.
Yeah,
Peter Hotez.
yeah,
Great
Peter's great. And you know, and it seemed like what was really disturbing to me was like the vast majority of the comments were about vaccines and so few about these unchecked diseases that are running rampant in poor communities, which was the most disturbing aspect of the conversation to me, that there's diseases that rob you of your intellectual capacity that are extremely common, that as many as 10% of people in these poor neighborhoods have. Almost no discussion. It was all just insults and you know, you fucking chill and this and that. And, you know, it's like,
I know, my mentions are going to be interesting, but
oh, they're going to be a disaster today.
I know. Well, I think that one of the challenges for the platforms is a lot of things start out, like Learn to Code. I remember, I watched that play out. Covington Catholic was another thing that, I mean, God. With Learn to Code, there was some of the people who were trolling and just saying Learn to Code and, you know, whatever,
right.
You don't have a right to not be offended. But then there was the other accounts that kind of took it that step further and began to throw in like the ovens and the other stuff with Learn to Code, right? And that's one of the challenges with the platform, which is if you're trying to assess the just the content itself, like if you start doing keyword bans,
right,
you're going to catch a lot of shit that you don't want to catch.
Right.
But the flip side is if you know, this is the challenge of moderating at scale, which is where, you know, what side do you come down on? Do you come down on saying like 75% of people with hashtag Learn to Code are just, you know, not doing anything incredibly offensive, and then the 25% who are, they really change the tone of the overall campaign and the hashtag for the entire community, and that's where you see Twitter, I think, come in with the more heavy-handed and just shut it down kind of thing. I I don't know that there's an easy answer. I think that we are, even today, what was the latest kerfuffle? Elizabeth Warren got an ad taken down on Facebook, and then there was a whole conversation about, was Facebook censoring Elizabeth Warren? I personally didn't think that it read like censorship. But
what was the ad about?
It was an ad about, funny enough, her platform to break up Facebook.
Whoa!
But
so Facebook took that down? Like, yeah, listen, hooker.
It seemed like it sort of read more like a cell phone. Like, she had a picture of Facebook's logo in the image, and that violates the ad's terms of service. And the reason behind that is actually because Facebook doesn't want people putting up ads that have the Facebook logo in it, because that's how you scam people, right? That's a great way to rip people off. And so probably just like an automated takedown, like it halts the ad. You have to go and make some changes, and then you can push the ad back out again. But it just happens at a time when there's like so little assumption of good faith and so little assumption of such extreme anger and polarization and assumption that the platforms are censoring with every little kind of moderation snafu, that it makes it, I think, I don't know how we have the conversation in a way that's healthy and looks towards solutions, as opposed to the left screaming that it's censored, the right screaming that it's censored, the platforms, trying to get around how do we both moderate and not moderate, which is a tough position to be in. I think, I don't have any good.
No one does.
No
That's
good answers.
Part of the issue, and Vidya discussed that pretty much in depth, where she was saying this is about moderating in scale when you're talking about millions and millions and millions of posts and a couple thousand people working for the organization.
Yeah.
And then algorithms and computer learning that's trying to keep up, and that's where things like Learn to Code, and people are so outraged and pissed off because when they do get banned, they feel like they've been targeted. Well, you really just ran into some code, and then it's really hard to get someone to pay attention to your appeal.
Right.
Because there's not enough people that are looking at these appeals, and there's probably millions of appeals every day. It's almost impossible.
Yeah, and there's, depending on which side you're on, you also hear like, this person is harassing me and I'm demanding moderation and nobody's doing anything about it.
Yes.
So it's definitely, I think, gotten worse. It's interesting to look back at 2016 and wonder how much of the where we are now is in part because not a whole lot happened in 2016. In 2016, or 2015 in particular, very light, like almost no moderation, just kind of let it all hang out there. And I look at it, now, particularly as it evolves into this conversation about free speech, public squares, and what the new kind of infrastructure for speech, what rights we should expect on it. It's a really tough, I think some of it is almost like the people who hear the words free speech and they just assume that it's people asking for a carte blanche right to harass and saying, how do we balance that? I think Jack and Vijay were saying this on your show. How do we maximize the number of people who are involved, make sure that all voices do get heard without being unnecessarily heavy-handed and moderating a thought or content, and instead moderate behavior, and instead moderate particular types of signatures of things that are inauthentic or things that are coordinated. And looking at this, again, gets to disinformation too, rather than trying to police disinformation by looking at content, really looking instead at actions and behavior and account authenticity and dissemination patterns. Because a lot of the worst trolls and stuff are just using these throwaway accounts and then they disappear.
Well, I have the impression myself that when we're talking about censorship, we're talking about moderating content, that really we're talking about this current era, and that what's coming is essentially we're like putting up a small twig fence and a herd of stampeding buffaloes on the way, in terms of the more invasive or the more potent levels of technology that are on the way. I just feel like everything is moving in a very specific direction, And that very specific direction is less boundaries between people and information. And that includes communication. And it's going to be insanely impossible, insanely difficult or nearly impossible to moderate in 10 years. I don't think it's going to be in the wheelhouse. I think it's going to, we're entering into some weird place where we're either going to have to stay off of social media because it's just too toxic, or grow a thick skin and just be able to deal with anything. And then if that's the case, how are we going to be able to differentiate between things that are particularly designed to manipulate us, specifically designed to manipulate us and change our opinions by foreign entities like this, this Russian troll farm?
I do think when I think about so if we believe that disinformation is in part facilitated by gameable algorithms, consolidation, and then the targeting, the kind of things we've talked about through this conversation, then I think that the algorithms piece, the manipulatable algorithms, that's really squarely the responsibility of the platforms. I don't think that there's any regulation or any kind of framework that's going to come from Congress that's going to address that.
Well, that was pretty clear from the Facebook hearings, right? I mean, they barely understood the difference between an Android phone and an iPhone. They really don't know what's going on.
Tim Apple.
Yeah. That's the king of the world.
Right. But
he says he did that on purpose, which is even more hilarious. Just say you fucked up, man. I mean, to say that you knew Tim Cook, his real name wasn't Tim Apple. It is funny calling him Tim Apple, though.
I did. I appreciated the rest of every CEO in Silicon Valley changing their Twitter handle afterwards.
Yeah, that was funny.
But I think which now I just lost my train of thought on that too.
Sorry.
No, it's
well,
okay.
we're talking about you were talking about them.
Regulating.
Gaming algorithms.
Regulating.
Yeah.
So I think that ultimately the algorithmic piece does remain squarely in the purview of the platforms, and that's because it's an arms race, right? As they change their algorithm a little bit, tweak it for the product function, which they just do in their role as business, there is no regulation that's going to come down fast enough to catch that. I think actually finance is an interesting parallel here. Because in the financial markets, there are kind of these multi-tiered levels of regulation and oversight, so that there's always some entity responsible, whether it's the exchange or a self-regulatory organization or the government, the SEC, looking to see if information integrity in the markets is being maintained, right? There's no shitty algorithm coming in to manipulate people. It's just making sure that we have that level of trust. So I think that right now the tech ecosystem is lacking regulation in all of its forms. So that will likely change. But the argument for decentralization is, I don't know how you execute it. The antitrust thing in particular, as it comes up so much more now. I don't know under what economic grounds you make that claim. That's way outside of my wheelhouse and my area. But there is something to be said for this, return to decentralization in some way. Yeah. I feel like it lets people have what they want. And it lets you, Reddit's a great example. You have these, almost like federalism. You have this central platform, but then you have these little communities under it. Yeah. And each community has its own norms. Each community has its own rules. Nobody who violates the moderator rules on a Reddit and screams censorship is really taken seriously.
Right.
This is the rules of the community, you're in the community, there you go. And this was how, in the olden days of the internet, like Usenets and things, you would have, this is the community that you've chosen to be a part of. If you don't like the moderation standards, you go to this other community. Right. I think the concern with consolidation is that people who do get moderated away feel like there's nowhere for them to go, that they've lost access to the entire world. So I think if you have that decentralization, it in some ways, it stops being quite so much of a freedom of speech issue if you can't speak on, if everything is if there's 50 different platforms and you fall afoul of some sort of norms or standards or community membership in this one, you can go over here to this other one.
Right.
Then the idea that somebody has moderated you away or deplatformed you or something is much less potent, maybe, if there are alternatives.
Reddit, though, if you dox someone or something along those lines,
there's still again that federalism thing. You have the little moderation at the lower levels versus kind of top level, like you're summarily booted off.
Yeah, that seems like the best approach, right? Like it seems like the best approach is to sort of let these communities sort of establish themselves. But even inside those communities, then you have people that gain power through moderation and they start abusing it, and then it becomes some sort of a weird hierarchy. It's like the decentralization in general is probably the right move for all this stuff, but how does that happen with something like Facebook or Twitter without government intervention? And that's one of the things that Tim Pool was bringing up. Like, if you guys don't do this, if you don't handle this, it's entirely possible somewhere down the line you're going to be regulated by the government. Do you really want that?
I think that that's an inevitability. Whether they
you think so?
Yeah, at this point, yeah.
What do you think is going to happen?
I think it just becomes. Well, honestly, I say that and then I think back to the reality, which is in this Congress with this executive, I don't know how we get any regulation through. I think we've seen some examples, like the Honest Ads Act, which was introduced right before the first tech hearing, if I'm remembering the timeline correctly. So that would have been like late 2017. And what they said was you can no longer have like a free-for-all with ads on social platforms where nobody knows who paid for it or where it's coming from or anything like that. And what they, so Senator Klobuchar and Senator Warner, and I think Senator McCain also was part of this, create this law saying that the platforms have to follow the rules that TV and radio already follow. And this is an example of recognizing the role that these are no longer startups that can't be, that can't meet these obligations. It used to be that Facebook was exempt from these disclosure requirements because their ads used to be remember those tiny postage stamp size things that were on the right side of the page? Mm-hmm. So they had a finding, and they were given the same exemption that campaigns get for like skywriting and postage and pencils, where it's like literally the form factor of the content makes it such that you can't put the ad disclaimer on there. And it used to be that all of the advertising on Facebook was regulated using that same finding, that these postage stamp size things are too small to put the disclosures on. And then, of course, as we know, that evolved into the ads looking much like an organic post. And so now they do have these little things that pop up where you can see why you got targeted and what it is. I think that that's an example of like the credible threat of regulation and the public opinion moving the platform to take an action that it wouldn't have necessarily done on its own. So it's not regulation, but it's a nudge through public opinion and the credible threat of future regulation. We've seen California go after the platforms also recently. There was that California GDPR thing from last year. California state legislature saying we're going to pass a privacy requirement. And they did it. They got it done.
What is the privacy requirement?
Oh, boy. I feel like I'm probably not the best person to explain this because I don't know the specifics, but the GDPR was the law in the UK and in Europe that protects the data. It creates particular protections, like you have to re-opt in for targeting. There's certain kinds of targeting that they can't do, certain types of data that you can request they delete. So this is a provision that took effect in Europe last year. We don't have that same law here in the U.S., where we don't have the same data protections as the Europeans. And so California GDPR was the California state government, the state Senate legislature, passing a law that basically mimicked a lot of the provisions of what the Europeans were given under GDPR. But what that did was it created a law that applied to the people of California. And so Facebook and Twitter and the others don't want to be in a position of having to have this